Hello everybody, Paradoxio here. Welcome back to a brand new video, everyone. This is part 5 of our web development series, and in this video we are going to be making a very simple mock form in our HTML page. Now this form is not going to have any kind of script tied to it, so we're not going to be working with any PHP or JavaScript. Now later we can work with JavaScript to create a sort of mock form submission. But with really how forms work in HTML is we can provide something that's known as an action. And that action is going to be tied to a PHP file, which could submit our form data to the server, which can then be processed, stored into a database if we're making something like an account, or, well, whatever we really want to do with it. Now, to create a form, it's actually very simple. All we have to do is just go in our HTML page, inside our body tag, and type in form. Now, by default, it's going to be looking for an action, and sometimes, depending on the IDE, it might look for a method as well. Both of these are kind of useless. We don't really need them. The action, like I said, a file path, your PHP file here. So that's where our file path to the PHP file is going to be. Now the method is the request method being made to the server. Are we going to use post or get? And we could type in post, get, and something called dialog as well. Now I don't ever use dialog, but I also don't use get. And on my main website at houseofcode.xyz, I use the post server request method. But all this information is pretty much useless because that's where we go into backend development with PHP or any kind of backend coding, whether it's Node.js, React, or whatever you plan on using. We're not going to get into that in this series, but there will be a series in the future on server-side scripting. So we're going to be working with a basic form element. And if we come up here, look at our page, there's nothing there yet. We need to add some form content, and this is going to be as inputs. Buttons, checkboxes, radios, etc. Now, when I go ahead and type in input, by default, it automatically goes to type text. Now, if I remove this, as you see, there's a lot of different types that we have to use here. Now, we're not going to go over all of them because, goodness gracious, this video would be like an hour long. But some of the most common ones that we have are button, checkbox. We have file, month, image, password, number, radio, search, submit, etc. We also have date and datetime local. We also have something called TEL. I'm not sure what that is. I've never really worked with it, but I imagine it would be fun checking that out ourselves. But we're mainly going to be focused on the basic ones like text, password, email, checkbox, radio, number, etc. So for our first one, we're just going to make this as type text. And if I go to my browser, as you see, we're going to have this little text box appear. And we can put stuff in it. We can type in our text. Now, there's a couple things we can do with this. Whoops, not a comma. We can type in a placeholder text, and this could be something like first name. And if I go back to my browser, now we have this little gray text. And whenever we put something in it, that gray text disappears. This is good for just providing basic information on what each input field is. Now, there's also something else known as a value. And this value is basically going to be the text that's inside this text box by default. So if we have something like John Doe, there's going to be text in a text box that's going to say John Doe, or going to have a value of the string John Doe. Now, I don't know if this is on all browsers, but I use Firefox for most of my web development. And the values, if I set a default value, it does not show up if our input tag is inside this form. But if I remove it and put it outside the form, it does show up. I imagine this has something to do with how form data works because of the way it's stored. And whenever we're talking about form values, I believe it's stored as metadata somewhere inside the HTML page where we can't see it. But if you use your input text boxes outside of a form element, then it'll show up just fine. But if I have this value here, and let's just say it's 1, 2, 3, even though the value doesn't show up, that value is still there. And when we get into JavaScript, we can use some scripting techniques to scrape that value from this text box. And whenever it's default, if I go ahead and type something else in it, it'll override this, or overwrite it, I should say, and we'll have a new value. Pretty neat. Now, let's create some other text boxes. But let's make one for password and one for email. And this one can be password as a placeholder. This one could be email address. Now, the browser's going to go ahead and leak my email address because of cookies, but my email address is already on YouTube, so I'm not too worried about it. But you may have noticed when it tried to put in my password here, it's in dots. Now, the value is whatever we typed in on our keyboard, but HTML has a very nice feature with form inputs as passwords, where whenever we type something in there, it's going to display it as a bunch of dots to hide our password. Now, we could use some JavaScript to actually unhide this password if we would like, but I'll show you guys how to do that later on in this series. So pretty neat. Now, I don't like how this form is set up, so let's use some CSS to style this to make it look a little bit more professional and cleaner. Inside our CSS file, I'm going to select the form element, and then I'm going to give it a width of 30%. Going to make it a flex box. Give it a flex direction of column. Align item center. And justify content as center as well. Now, I don't like how there's practically no space in between these text boxes. So let's give it a gap of 2%. Let's actually give it a little bit more of a gap. There we go. Now, part of our text box is going to bleed into our menu bar. So let's fix that. There we go. Give it a margin of 2%. Let's actually do it a little bit more. There we go. Perfect. Now inside this form, we can add an H1 element like sign up. And we could style that H1 element. And the way I have selected my element I want to style, I've said form H1. Now what this is going to do is it's only going to style the H1 elements inside of the form element. So if I have an H1 element out here, it's not going to get styled. Now, of course, you can give us a class name if you would like, but if you only have one H1 element, there's not really much of a need to do that. Let's go ahead and make the color white. Make the font family as Arial. Make the font weight bold. And look at that. That looks a little bit better already. Now, something I want to do with this form is I want to give it a background color. So I'm going to copy the same background color for the body here. And I'm going to paste it in here. Or whoops. background color. But I'm going to make it a tad bit darker. And the cool thing, I think I've already shown you guys this, but the cool thing about Visual Studio's Code is we get a little color selector that we can drag a pointer to get the color that we want. Now, this looks horrible. And it has something to do with it has something to do with the gap percentages here. We're going to remove those for now because we're going to add some padding into this form here by typing in padding, and we can give it 4%. Actually, that might be a bit too much. Let's stick with 2. Perfect. Now we can give it a gap of 10 pixels. Now, what gap does is it's going to add space in between each element, but it's not going to add space around it. So there is no extra space being created from under this email address box and the bottom of this form. And if I go ahead and remove that, as you see, the space has not changed. So keep in mind, it's only going to add space in between each form input element or whatever we have inside our form. Go ahead and give it a border radius of 15 pixels. Now, you're probably wondering, why am I using pixels now and not percents anymore? Percents are more practical as they're easier to work with whenever we resize the screen of our browser. Well, the reason why is because when I introduce percents instead of pixels on border radius, we get this. Doesn't look very good, doesn't look even at all. So using pixels ensures that it has even, rounded edges on each side. Now we could do a gap of 2%, but doesn't give us much space. Maybe 10% would be a little bit better. And now if I go ahead and resize this, actually it looks like it doesn't change much. So we might have to do a little bit more here. Specifically with the media selector, which we'll talk about in another video. For now, let's just leave this as 10 pixels. I mean, that's plenty of space in between each of these input boxes. Let's add a couple more inputs. Let's do a number. Let's do a checkbox. And let's do a radio button. If you look up here, we have a number, which we could type in text, but we don't want to. This is strictly for having numbers. Let's talk about a little bit more about this email text box here. And what this email text box is going to do is if we ever try to submit this form with a PHP file or any sort of server scripting file, basically our browser's not going to let us because it's expecting an @ symbol and then something following it, whether it's gmail.com or Outlook or Hotmail or whatever you have. It's expecting an @ symbol to be somewhere in this text box. So that's pretty neat. Now I don't have any server-side script to show this happening, but whenever we try to submit the form, that will happen. It will tell us, hey, you don't have a proper email address put in here. Now keep in mind, it does not check if the email address exists. It's just going to check if it's in correct format. So do keep that in mind. Now we have checkboxes here. And a radio button. But there's not much information on them. Well, what we can do is we can assign our checkbox IDs. And IDs are typically used when we introduce JavaScript, but we can use IDs for other stuff in HTML, like labels. So what I can do is I can type in label, and under the for parameter, we're going to put in the ID, which is checkbox. And then We can type in checkbox right here. And now we have a label for our checkbox. We can do the same thing for our radio button. Whoops. Now we can style the text by also, instead of copying and pasting it, we can just do form label. Now if I come back here, our form labels look a lot better. Let's talk about buttons. Now, there's different kinds of ways we can use buttons. We can use buttons with a type of submit, which is going to submit a form to a server, or we can just use a standalone button by itself. Now, the cool thing about buttons is we don't have to use them in a form. If we wanted to, we can just use them on the outside. See, now I have a button out here. Let's style this button to look a tad bit better, and let's also style our inputs because they look horrible. So, form input. We're going to make the width 50% of the actual form's width. So we're going to make it half the width of the form. And we're going to give it a text align of center. And this is going to make the placeholder text appear in the center rather than on the left side. And this also is going to work for the values as well. So pretty neat. Now, we're also going to remove the border. There's a little small border around these. Let's remove it. There we go. And let's give it a font size of 16 pixels. Let's give it a font weight of bold. And let's also give it a font family of Arial. There we go. Now, let's give this input a background color. And we're going to do it the same color as this here, but we're going to make it a tad bit more darker. Or we can also do lighter if we would like. Do it a little bit lighter. There we go. Pretty neat. Now, what we can also do is we can give it a color of white to make our text appear as white. Pretty neat. And what we can also do is we can give it a padding of the top of like 1%. And we're going to do the same thing for padding bottom. And this just adds some space in between the top and bottoms of our text inside that text box. Now let's give it a border radius. Let's say 15 pixels again. And that might actually be a little bit too much. Let's do 10 pixels. Still a little too much. Let's do 5 pixels. There we go. Has a little bit of a smoother edge, while also retaining that nice blocky texture, or not texture, but a nice blocky structure. Now, that's pretty much it for what we can do with these input boxes. Now, these still work the same way. It does not affect how the text boxes work. Instead, it's just going to affect how it looks, and it looks really nice. Let's go ahead and style the button. Now the button's going to be really fun because we can have effects with it. Alrighty. Form button. Let's make the button a width of, let's say, 15%. There we go. And a height of 5%. Let's do 10. Let's do 50. Okay, maybe for height, we're going to do pixels instead. So let's do 50 pixels. And for the width, let's increase that to 20%. All right, there we go. Now the font's size, we can do 16 pixels. Or let's try to do 15% and see if that can change anything. Okay, that's very tiny. Let's do 100%. Maybe 110%. Or 150%. Oh yes, that looks a lot better. And then let's do a font family of Arial, a font weight of bold. Let's do a color of white, a border of, and this is the fun part, we're going to have a unique little button animation for when we hover on it. So, for now, let's leave the border as 0, because we're going to come back to that. But let's make the background color somewhat to fit in this blue theme. Now, actually, I like this color here. That looks perfect. Now that we have figured out what kind of color we want our button to be, let's come back here. In border, we're going to type in 2 pixels, space, solid, space, and then RGB. And then we're going to make our background color transparent. And this gives us a little bit of a nice solid border around our button. And you're going to see why I'm doing this. Let's give it a border radius of 10 pixels. Let's give it a cursor of pointer, so that way when we hover over it, we have an actual pointer, so we know it's a real button. Now, here's the fun part. We're going to type in transition. Now, typically transitions aren't the best because they can actually slow our website down. But depending on who your target audience of this website is, like maybe if it's gamers or someone who you may know would have a pretty fast internet connection, this might be okay. But if your website's targeted to the general public, you may want to be a little bit easy on the animations because they can slow the website's load time down for some people. So, for transition, what we're going to do is whenever I hover over this button, I want the button to fill with that same color that our border is. So, what we're going to do is we're going to type in background dash color. In 0.3 seconds. Now, here comes the fun part. I'm going to copy and paste this color here. And in here, we're going to type in form button hover. Whoops. Background color. There we go. Now, if I go ahead and hover over this button, we get a nice little hover animation. Now, you don't have to do it like this. You can have it change whatever you want whenever you hover over the button. Typically, this is going to be the color, of course. But you don't have to do it with the border like I did. Instead, if you wanted to, and let's remove the border. Actually, let's leave it as 0. Could do something like that, but with the background color, let's make it a tad bit darker. Now when I hover over it, the button just lights up a little bit. You could also do something like that with your buttons if you would like. Does not really matter, it's just whatever fits the theme of your website the best. Personally, I like the first animation I did. I like that. That's what I plan on using on my own websites when I update the CSS again. And I just learned that recently, actually. I probably would have figured it out on my own, but I needed the inspiration from some other videos I've seen with those buttons. But this is pretty neat. So we can give some hover animations to our buttons, and it doesn't even have to be buttons. If we wanted to, we can give a hover animation to this. So if I wanted to type in form input hover, I can just copy and paste this. Now the inputs are gonna change background color whenever I hover over them. Now this is instantaneous until we add a transition property to these form inputs. Now there's going to be some time before it hovers to that before it lights up to that new color that we want it to change to upon hover. So that's pretty neat. With some basic HTML, we pretty much made a mock sign-up form. Think of this click me button here as a form submission, and for some reason when I click it, it just refreshes the page. Let's remove that. But we made ourselves a little simple sign-up form with some basic HTML and CSS, and in the future, we're going to tie this to a script. So don't chuck this and make your own just yet, or if you want to make your own, you can. Here's a good challenge for you. Try to implement some sort of other kind of form, maybe an order form, or some sort of application form. Try to make something like that. And if you want to share your creations with that in my Discord server, you can in the code dump channel. And speaking of that, if you're ever stuck on any code, whether it's from this video or a different one, feel free to join that server and we can help you out with that. Feel free to also create yourself a free account on houseofcode.xyz. The link will be in the description. And so far on there, you can share your scripts with other people by creating an account and uploading them to the House of Code server. Right now, I am currently working on the forum system, and pretty soon you'll be able to create and upload forums to my website as well. But that is all for today. You guys have a wonderful day, and don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and comment. Bye-bye.